Morning. Thank you. We now move on in our program to introduce our fourth keynote speaker, Dr. Charlie Paphitis. Charlie is a senior research fellow at King's College in London's Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience, specializing in qualitative research, global mental health, and social justice research. She's a recognized expert in qualitative and participatory research methodologies. Dr. Paphitis has led complex interdisciplinary research funded by various large donors addressing critical challenges in violence, abuse, and mental health worldwide. Charlie's global health expertise extends through her work with the NIHR Global Health Research Group to improve the mental health of violence survivors in Southeast Asia and assessing psychosocial interventions for violent extremism in Nigeria. Her work is deeply rooted in co-production with NGOs, survivor groups, and community stakeholders, ensuring research outcomes are both practical and transformative. So we move from the global to more local level. Some of you know Charlie. She read for her PhD at Rhodes University. Something even better, she worked for the Rhodes Community Engagement Office from 2014 to 2020. And this conference was the brainchild of Charlie. She ran the first symposium in 2015. So if you look at that banner, you'll see the first symposium that was conceptualized by her. And then in 2016, she went on to win the Vice Chancellor's Distinguished Community Engagement Award for her work in a project by the name of Siyahluma. And she won it with Lindsay Kelland, who's somewhere at the back. Wave your hand, Lindsay, so we all say, hey, right here. Which was the highest accolade one can be awarded at Rhodes. In 2021, she published the first book that our division had prepared. She co-authored it. The book is called Challenging the Apartheid of Knowledge in Higher Education Through Social Innovation. And the amazing thing is later, after this session, we launch another Roos book. So it's all these fantastic circles within circles. There's a Xhosa proverb that says, umntu ngumntu ngabantu. And it means a person is a person through other people. And it also speaks to our humanity, how it's shaped by relationships, emphasizing the interdependence of people. And I think of how Charlie was a part and how she's moved on and how she's creating what she is creating now on a global level with the influences and the relationships on which she built. And we all grew from that too. The title of Charlie's talk today is, what does it mean to cultivate humanity in higher education now? On practicing being human in a precarious, technologically mediated world. So, welcome back, Charlie. The legacy you left continues to grow, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much, Di. That was such a warm welcome, and just to say thank you to everyone for coming after lunch on day 2. I'm very humbled that so many of you have come to listen to me talk. I really am. And I hope that what I talk about today is going to be interesting to all of you. A lot of what I'm speaking on today isn't stuff that I get to usually talk about anymore in the work that I do, but it does inform the way that I carry out research and also the way that I work as an educator in higher education, which is something that I don't think we spend enough time thinking about. So, what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to briefly outline Martha Nussbaum's very influential account of cultivating humanity and her insistence that higher education has a moral and democratic purpose beyond economic utility. I think that her articulation of the three capacities we've heard about a little bit before really gives us a compelling vocabulary for what we might hope that education can do in the world. At the same time, I'm going to suggest that those capacities risk remaining quite abstract if we treat them as outcomes to exposure to ideas alone, right? What I'm going to argue today is that cultivating these capacities depends on something much deeper. It actually depends on the kinds of meaning making that our universities make possible. And so I'm going to suggest three things today, which is a lot to get through, so I'm going to stick to my script and not go off on tangents, because otherwise we'll be here for hours. So the first thing I'm going to suggest is that community engagement is a foundational practice through which the cultivation of humanity becomes embodied and relational. The second thing I'm going to suggest is that institutional culture plays a very critical role in cultivating humanity. But specifically here, I want to talk about the everyday conditions of academic life that play out in the relational practices that we model. My central claim here is actually a very simple one, but one that isn't very easily achieved by imperfect people such as ourselves operating in a very imperfect world. Cultivating humanity isn't possible without a university culture that nurtures it, but that culture is made moment by moment in how we choose to show up day in and day out. I'm going to repeat that. It's how we choose to show up day in and day out. And then finally, the last thing I'm going to talk about is the introduction of these accelerated knowledge systems and AI into higher education. And I think they pose some very serious problems for meaning making. And this threatens to undermine the possibility of cultivating humanity. So this is where we're going. Before I get into all of that, and before I get into Nussbaum's account, I just want to start with this idea of cultivating humanity itself. It's something we've all been throwing around at this conference. It's a big idea, but what do we actually mean when we say cultivating humanity? So let's start with this idea of humanity. I think here we're usually pointing to a set of moral capacities, the ability to recognize others as fully human, to respond to others with empathy and care, to take responsibility for our actions and their effects, to remain attentive to others, and to hold some commitment to justice. So in this sense, humanity is not simply a given. It's not given. It's something that's expressed in how we relate to others. It's an orientation that's characterized by recognition, care, and accountability. And it's in this sense which thinkers like Martha Nussbaum describe the role of education in forming citizens who are capable of sustaining a flourishing society. But let's come to this idea of cultivating now. So cultivating, I think, names the way this orientation is actually formed. It's not a moment of insight. It's not a set of values that we simply proclaim, but it's something that is practiced into being through repetition, through habits of attention, and through the slow shaping of character in relationship with others. It's this daily work of becoming the kind of person and building the kind of institution for whom dignity, care, and critical thought are not aspirational add-ons, but are ways of life. In this sense, I'm drawing here on a very Aristotelian understanding of moral formation, where we become just or courageous, not by declaring that we are just or we are courageous, but by repeatedly acting justly and courageously. So this idea of cultivating humanity is never just about what the humanity we're referring to is, but it's about the kinds of environments and practices that shape it. And the environments and practices are important because they shape how meaning itself is made. Moral development is not separate from meaning making. It's constituted through it. And we come to recognize others, to take responsibility, and to orient ourselves towards justice through the ways in which we interpret the world, right? The ways in which we interpret ourselves and our relationships with others. And I'll come back to this in more detail a little bit later, because I think meaning making is actually really central to this idea of cultivating humanity. So I want to briefly look at Nussbaum's account, because I think that her account of cultivating humanity provides this really compelling normative starting point for thinking about the moral purpose of higher education. In her book, Cultivating Humanity, she argues that universities shouldn't merely transmit technical knowledge, right, but that they should form human beings capable of thoughtful and compassionate participation in a diverse and democratic world. And in her book, Not for Profit, which came out later, she extends that argument in response to the increasing instrumentalization of higher education. She warns that when higher education is reduced to economic productivity, democratic life is weakened, right? For her, a flourishing society requires not only technical expertise, of course it does require that, but it also requires citizens capable of critical thought, resistance to unreflective authority, and most importantly, compassion. So I want to look at Nussbaum's three capacities in a little bit more detail. I know that they have been mentioned by quite a few speakers, but we haven't really delved into them. And I think it's actually important to look at them in a bit more detail and see what's going on with it. So I'm going to run through them. And the first capacity that Nussbaum advocates for is this idea of critical self-examination, the capacity to critically examine yourself and your traditions, right? So Nussbaum discusses critical self-examination in terms of the ability to question your inherited beliefs, traditions, and authorities, rather than just accepting them uncritically. For her, we need to cultivate in students the ability to critically reflect on their own beliefs, their traditions, their practices. But what Nussbaum is asking students to do here is to think for themselves. It's a tall order, right? It's a tall order. The second capacity that Nussbaum advocates is the ability to see oneself as a citizen not of a particular nation, but of a broader and interdependent world. So Nussbaum thinks that students need to understand their place in this broader global context and to learn to view their own community as part of a complicated world order in which issues of many kinds that we're seeing play out every day at the moment require intelligent transnational deliberation for their resolution. We certainly need some of that right now. She thinks that students need to grasp issues beyond their immediate community and at the same time appreciate the interconnectedness of all humanity. I think at the heart of her argument here is the claim that people must learn to see themselves not only as members of local communities or nations, but above all as human beings, bound to all other human beings through ties of recognition and concern, right? Concern for each other. So humanity in this sense is again that ethical orientation towards shared vulnerability and mutual responsibility. And the final capacity, narrative imagination. According to Nussbaum, this means the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of somebody very different to oneself. And here she argues that the capacity for sympathetic imagination will enable us to comprehend the motives and choices of people very different from ourselves. I think we really need to do this in community engagement work. And this will allow us to see them not as forbiddingly alien or other, but as sharing many problems and, most importantly, possibilities with us. So those are Nussbaum's capacities. Now, taken together, I think these capacities give us a very powerful account of what cultivating humanity might involve. it's a big job. But they also offer us a vocabulary for thinking about the kinds of people higher education might seek to form. And they're compelling and they're very necessary capacities. But I think there's an important question lingering here now, which is how, in practice, are these capacities actually formed? And Nussbaum's answer to this is that it's through the humanities, through literature, history, and the arts, that students are invited into worlds other than their own, and they can develop all three of these capacities. Now, the process Nussbaum is referring to here can't simply be one of mere exposure. It's not that we get exposed to these things and magically we develop the capacities, right? Something else is going under it. I think what's going on underneath it is that what's happening is an induction into particular forms of meaning making, right? So what exactly do I mean here by meaning making? I think one way, at least one way, there might be others, but one way to understand what's going on in the kinds of educational processes Nussbaum is describing is through this idea of semiosis, right? Particularly how it's developed in the work of Charles Sanders Peirce. Semiosis here refers to the process through which something comes to have meaning for someone. Here, meaning isn't simply a definition or a piece of information. It refers to how something is understood and what follows from that understanding in terms of thought and your possible response to it. So for Peirce, this idea of semiosis refers to a process through which meaning is generated through the relation of three elements. The first one is a sign, what we might call a trigger. It's anything that we perceive, a word, an image, a gesture, a memory, that stands for something else. And the second one is the object to which the sign refers, the actual event, idea, or physical thing. And finally, and most importantly, the interpretant, that is, the understanding produced in the mind of the interpreter. So a sign includes anything that stands for something else and is capable of being interpreted. Now, I don't want to get into the academic weeds on this because we very easily could, right? But I think what's important is that a key feature of Peirce's account is that meaning is not fixed or contained within signs themselves. Meaning emerges through the activity of interpretation, and crucially, each interpretation generates a further sign which can in turn be interpreted again. So this process of meaning making, semiosis, is ongoing, potentially unbounded, and meaning develops over time through successive acts of interpretation. What follows from this is that meaning isn't arbitrary or indeterminate, but rather that any given interpretation that we have remains provisional and open to revision. Interpretations may be challenged, refined, or reworked in light of new encounters that we have, additional information we receive, or alternative perspectives that we encounter. So this idea of meaning making is never oriented towards final certainty, right? It's oriented towards the ongoing development of more adequate understandings. So two key points I want to make about this idea of meaning making, or semiosis if you want to call it that, is that first, meaning is not passively received, it's actively produced, right? When our students are making meaning, they're not passively receiving it from us, it's being actively produced by them. And interpretation always involves the work of relating new signs to prior understandings, contexts, and experiences. Second, meaning is inherently open and revisable. This is the point of education. Meaning is open and revisable. That's what we're trying to do when we work with students. And this is because each interpretation becomes the basis for further interpretation. Understanding is always provisional and responsive to new encounters. So I think what this account allows us to see is that Nussbaum is right, in a sense. Part of her argument is right, that the humanities are at the center of cultivating humanity. I think at their best, humanities education inducts students into processes and practices of meaning making that I've just been talking about. Students are invited to interpret texts, to encounter multiple perspectives, to sit with ambiguity, and to work through competing interpretations and revise their understanding over time. But I think that this type of semiosis that we're seeing, typically sustained within humanities education, is often structured in a way that remains relatively contained. Interpretation is oriented towards texts or representations rather than towards situations where students are directly implicated. The objects of interpretation are often at a temporal, geographical, or social distance. And importantly, I think most importantly, the consequences of interpretation, of meaning making, are limited to the domain of understanding itself. So what does this all mean for Nussbaum's capabilities? Well, I think that the conditions under which critical self-examination becomes possible are much more fragile than Nussbaum's accounts suggest. In practice, this rarely requires both institutional permission to dissent and opportunities to sit with ambiguity. Ask yourselves honestly, how often do our classrooms, or indeed our universities, truly allow for this? How often? I think too often self-examination is contained within the boundaries of higher education classrooms rather than environments in which questioning carries real consequences. Students might be invited to think critically, yet only in the parameters that leave institutional norms, disciplinary hierarchies, and assessment regimes largely intact. And critically, in my experience, is too often reduced to an intellectual exercise rather than being given room to be developed and expressed as the disruptive force critical self-reflection really ought to be. So I think if critical self-examination is to be more than an academic competency, it needs to be cultivated in contexts that allow discomfort, disagreement, and reflexive vulnerability. Now, the capacity to see oneself as a global citizen is particularly urgent, I think, in the world. I've kind of suggested that before: forced migration, ecological crisis, resurgent nationalistic chauvinism, all of these things. But here too, I think there is a risk of abstraction. When global citizenship is confined to curricular content rather than enacted relationship, it might cultivate informed observers rather than accountable participants. If this capacity is to be more than an intellectual disposition, it's got to be grounded in experiences that situate students within systems of interdependence rather than positioning them as detached analysts of these situations. And this crucially involves proximity. Nussbaum's emphasis on narrative and moral imagination, I think, is undoubtedly one of her greatest contributions to this area of thought. I think it's fantastic. Yet, I think imagination alone is surely not enough, right? It's insufficient. The capacity to imagine another's experience does not guarantee ethical accountability. It's possible for me to feel empathy without relinquishing my power, or to appreciate stories without altering my own position within unjust structures. So when imagination is detached from embodied encounters and relational experiences, it might deepen my sympathy and my sensitivity, but it will still fail to influence future action that I take. So I think a useful illustration here comes from moral philosophy itself. Peter Singer is a very famous moral philosopher, and he has a very famous paper called Famine, Affluence, and Morality. And in that paper, he argues that those of us living in affluent societies are morally obligated to prevent suffering caused by global poverty whenever we can do so without comparable sacrifice. Now, this argument has been widely taught in universities and beyond, and discussed for decades now. He wrote in the 70s this argument. But it's clear to me, many people find this argument very compelling, right? everyone agrees there's very little we can find wrong with Singer's argument. It makes sense. If we can prevent suffering by sacrificing something that's not comparably important, we should do that, right? People are compelled. But the scale of redistribution in society currently shows me that the reasoning that's followed from Singer has not led to a widespread recognition and redistribution of resources. So we know these things intellectually, but we don't act on them, right? And Susan Sontag, I think, makes a very related point in her reflections on the representation of suffering. Exposure to stories or images of injustice might deepen our awareness of suffering, and it might lead to some compassion, but it doesn't always reliably produce the actions necessary to address the conditions that generate suffering. So where does this lead us all? If we take this kind of pragmatist account of meaning making that I've outlined kind of seriously, meaning isn't exhausted by understanding alone. It also concerns what follows from that understanding in thought and in action. So when meaning making is largely confined to interpretive engagement at a distance, it can produce forms of understanding that are intellectually sophisticated, but only weakly connected to response, responsibility, and action. Now, what I want to suggest is that community engagement doesn't replace the forms of meaning making that we cultivate in the humanities, but that it extends and transforms them by placing interpretation in contexts where it is necessarily relational, situated, and consequential. So the question isn't whether students are interpreting, but whether their interpretations are ever required to actually matter, right? I think that's the key. And this tension isn't new. What I'm saying isn't a new tension. Dewey, in Democracy and Education, argued that democratic habits can't be cultivated through the transmission of ideas alone. They've got to be formed through participation in practices that require cooperation, reflection, and responsibility. And in this sense, Dewey echoes that much earlier insight that's already present in Aristotelian thought that I mentioned earlier, that moral dispositions develop through habituation and practice rather than intellectual assent alone. And it's in following this that I suggest that cultivating the capacities Nussbaum sees as essential requires pedagogical context beyond what the humanities can provide. Otherwise, they remain abstract ideals rather than transformative practices. And by practices here, I don't mean academic practices, I mean action, what we actually go out into the world and do. So I suggest that community engagement is not a peripheral or a supplementary activity in higher education learning. It is foundational to an education that seeks to cultivate humanity. While Nussbaum articulates those capacities required for democratic life, Freire reminds us that such capacities are forged not through reflection, but through dialogical encounter in the world. Community engagement creates spaces in which knowledge becomes relational, embodied, accountable. My suggestion is that if we return to Nussbaum's three capacities, community engagement provides a context in which critical self-examination, global citizenship, and narrative imagination can be practiced and enhanced. So how does that work? I mean, I think it's clear to most of us, everyone here has been thinking about this for a long time, but reflection is not incidental to community engagement. It's actually constitutive of the learning that takes place in it. And I want to build on this and suggest that reflection can be understood as the process through which meaning making is made explicit and allows it to be open to revision. It's through guided reflection that students interrogate their assumptions, confront the limits of their prior understandings, and they go on to express what they think by reinterpreting those experiences and meanings that they had previously taken for granted. So in this sense, the reflection involved in community engagement is not simply retrospective. We're not looking back on what happened. It's actually the place where ethical and intellectually meaningful experiences become real for people. It's where they make meaning. So this is where interpretation is slowed down for students, right? They examine and rework what they think, and it enables a space to actually practice critical self-examination that Nussbaum describes, in a space where that reflection matters for tomorrow's relationships that I have with the communities I'm working with. And I think engagement frequently places students in very uncomfortable and unfamiliar situations that destabilize the inherited certainties that they have. Mesereau describes this as disorienting dilemmas. I really love that term. And he sees these as instances of cognitive and emotional friction that prompt the reevaluation of previously taken for granted beliefs. So these are moments in which existing interpretations begin to break down and they require reconfiguration. So one study that I was involved in, Joyce Surrey is here, this is a study I did with her a long time ago, I think illustrates this dynamic really nicely. So we were running a service learning course in the chemistry department. Students were required to maintain reflective journals, as is good practice, alongside their community-based activities. And Joyce and I performed an analysis of 80 journals that revealed that while the course was formally aimed to develop science communication skills, students' reflections actually overwhelmingly centered on personal growth, the questioning of stereotypes, and increased social awareness. And one student wrote in their journal, this has stuck with me for a decade or more. The student wrote, "At that point I realized I'd been stereotyping due to the things we hear and see on the news. I learned that I should stop stereotyping and rather reevaluate my facts and opinions." I wish students were writing more things like this now, given what we see on the news. So what we can see in an account like this is not simply a change in opinion, it's a shift in interpretation. The student is revisiting prior understandings, recognizing how they were formed, and beginning to reinterpret both others and themselves differently. So moments like this capture critical self-examination in practice, not as abstract reasoning, but as a reconfiguration of meaning through lived recognition of their own space. And through this, I think students are not merely imagining the perspective of meaning making, meaning here is no longer generated in isolation with a text. It emerges through interaction with others who are themselves interpreting and responding and contributing to that process. And this demands ethical humility and the willingness to be transformed by that encounter, both through the necessary reflective process and for ongoing engagement. If I'm not listening to my partners, they're not going to want to work with me anymore. So I'm forced to do this. Now, moral imagination and community engagement, I think in this way, becomes accountable and action-oriented because it's situated within that relationship. It's not just a matter of seeing differently, it's a matter of responding differently in light of what that seeing makes possible. So what I've presented so far isn't it a rejection of Nussbaum's capacity, don't get me wrong. I'm suggesting that community engagement provides a pedagogical site in which those capacities are practiced and deepened. And more specifically, community engagement does transform the conditions under which meaning-making takes place. It brings students into forms of meaning-making that are not only interpretive, but are relational, situated, and consequential. I've repeated that a few times, but it's my key message. I really want you to take that away. But there's something I want to add to the picture here. If we take seriously the idea that cultivating humanity depends on the kinds of meaning-making practices our university makes possible, then we also need to attend to the conditions under which those practices occur within universities themselves. Now, universities are often described as neutral spaces of inquiry and reason, but institutions are never neutral. And from the perspective that I've been developing, this is essential because meaning-making doesn't unfold in a vacuum. The kinds of interpretations that are possible, the extent to which they can be questioned, and whether they can actually be revised without penalty are all shaped by the institutional context. So if cultivating humanity is a matter of formation and practice, then the institutional environment where those practices occur isn't incidental. Institutional culture shapes what can be said, how disagreement is handled, and what forms of responses are enabled or constrained. So institutional culture isn't simply part of the background, it's actually a central condition of the possibility for the kinds of meaning-making through which humanity is cultivated. Now, look, there's a lot to say about institutional culture and a lot that other people have said about institutional culture, and I don't want to cover any of that ground today. Instead, I want to focus on something that I don't think is spoken about enough, and something which, even when it is recognized, I think doesn't inform everyday academic life as much as it ought to. I think that if we want to cultivate humanity in our students, we need to ask ourselves a critical and perhaps deeply uncomfortable question. What do students see when they look at us? And here I don't only mean us academics, but I mean all of us who are involved in their learning, including community partners and those they encounter through engagement. Are we modeling the humanity we are trying to cultivate? Students are learning all the time, not only through the formal teaching that we give them, not through structured engagement activities, but through the everyday relational life of the spaces that they move through. They are watching how we interpret each other. They are watching how we respond to challenge. They are watching how we handle disagreement and how we conduct ourselves in moments of tension and uncertainty. And this is something I've been thinking about for a very long time. In fact, the very first conference paper I ever presented as a very young philosophy student was on the academic culture around philosophical argument. I'd become very uneasy with the adversarial tone that often characterizes philosophical exchange. Arguments were not always engaged with, but attacked. Questions were not always invitations to think further, but performances of intellectual dominance. And at the time, I found myself asking what this model of critique was teaching those of us who were still learning how to think. Philosophy has been criticized very widely for precisely this kind of adversarial method that I was talking about, and debates about diversity in that discipline have suggested that those highly combative norms of engagement contribute to exclusionary climates, and that's why we don't see philosophy transformed in the way it might otherwise be. But even before I had the language of diversity or epistemic injustice, my concern was more immediate. Students are watching. They are not only watching how academics behave towards one another, but how we, together with community partners, relate across difference, across institutional boundaries, and within contexts where power, vulnerability, and responsibility are often very unevenly distributed. And from the perspective of meaning-making, what they are witnessing are not only arguments or interactions, but lived examples of how to interpret others, of how to respond to them. They are learning, often very implicitly, what kinds of interpretations are permissible, whose perspectives are taken seriously, and what it means to act in relation to others. So in this sense, the relational life of both the university and the community spaces we enter forms part of what we might call the hidden curriculum, the informal norms and practices through which values are transmitted to our students. But more than this, it's through these everyday encounters that students come to understand what life is actually like, beyond what we might say about empathy, justice, or care. And all of this leads to, I think, a simple but very demanding point. If we are interested in cultivating humanity in our students, then what we say is not enough. Who we are, how we act, and how we relate to others becomes part of the educational process. Collegiality can't just be reduced to performative niceness. It can't be confined to academic spaces alone. It's got to extend to how we engage with community partners, how we share power, how we listen, and how we respond when our assumptions are challenged, because students are watching that. I think that these relational practices are foundational, not only for staff well-being or for ethical partnerships, but precisely because students are watching how they unfold. They are watching how people actually behave in the world. They are forming an understanding not just of academic life, but of social life more broadly, through what they see enacted around them by us. And if we hope to cultivate humanity in our students, we've got to embody it in our own interactions. The hidden curriculum across both universities and community spaces, I think, is one of the most powerful ways in which meaning, and therefore humanity, is formed. Okay, before concluding, because I realize I've been speaking for quite a long time now, I do want to briefly turn to a contemporary development that I think raises important questions for everything that I've said so far: the increasing presence of accelerated knowledge systems and AI within higher education. Now, I want to begin with stating the argument for AI use in the knowledge economy in its strongest form. We should take it in that way. We shouldn't make it a straw man. So the argument doesn't claim that AI replaces thinking altogether. Rather, it begins by distinguishing between different kinds of cognitive work involved in knowledge production. A significant proportion of academic labor is not the high-level, interpretive, or creative work that we tend to value, but more repetitive, procedural, time-consuming tasks. These include summarizing literature, formatting references, wow, that is quite a repetitive task, transcribing interviews, coding large data sets, at a basic level, drafting early versions of text, or identifying patterns. The claim is that this layer of work, while necessary, doesn't always require deep human insight at every level or every stage. From there, the argument makes a second move, that contemporary AI systems are increasingly capable of handling precisely these kinds of tasks. They can process large volumes of information quickly, identify recurring structures, automate processes that would otherwise consume significant time, energy, and most importantly for some people, money, right? And if routine cognitive labor can be offloaded to AI, then human thinkers are freed to focus on what is understood as higher order intellectual work: interpretation, critical judgment, theory building. So in this sense, AI is framed as a kind of cognitive infrastructure, like earlier tools, statistical software, search engines, calculators, right? But it's just a bit more expansive in scope. And the claim is not simply about efficiency, it's about redistribution. Instead of spending time on mechanical tasks, students and researchers can spend more time engaging with meaning, ambiguity, and complexity if we offload some of this. Now, I think what's striking about this argument is that it rests on a very particular way of thinking about what thinking is. It assumes that cognition can be cleanly divided into routine and higher order processes, and that the former can be removed without altering the conditions under which the latter takes place. It's precisely here that, from the perspective I've been developing throughout this whole talk, that something quite important drops out of the picture. Meaning is not something that appears at the end of a process once the real thinking begins. Activities such as reading, annotating, summarizing, coding, comparing are not simply preliminary or mechanical. They are the very sites where interpretation is formed, where distinctions are noticed, where surprise occurs, and where one meaning gives way to another. So from this perspective, what's described as routine cognitive labor is often precisely where meaning making happens. When researchers work through transcripts manually, for example, they are not simply processing data, they are encountering ambiguity, they are sitting with tensions, they are noticing what resists easy categorization. And this is not incidental labor. It's constitutive of understanding. There's a second related issue, I think. Meaning making is not only iterative, it's often disruptive. Meaning develops through friction, through competing interpretations, misreadings, moments where things don't quite fit. Now, if AI systems smooth, summarize, and stabilize meaning too early, they risk prematurely closing down this interpretive space. And what appears as efficiency can become a form of epistemic narrowing, where ambiguity is resolved before it's done its very important work. And in this sense, the concern is not simply that AI produces answers quickly, but that it compresses the process through which meaning remains open, contestable, and revisable. Now, this becomes even more significant when we consider forms of knowledge that are relational. As thinkers such as Ferreira and Miranda Fricker remind us, knowledge is not only produced individually, but it emerges between people in conditions of dialogue, power, and recognition. In community engagement, and particularly in participatory or lived experience research, the labor of knowledge production is relational labor. It involves listening, negotiating meaning, being accountable to others' interpretations, and sometimes being unsettled by them. If AI takes over parts of the process that mediate between experience and knowledge, there's a real risk that relational labor is thinned out or bypassed entirely. AI does not participate in relationships of accountability. It does not have to answer to participants. It does not have to sit with discomfort or negotiate meaning in shared spaces. Those things are not inefficiencies in our knowledge production process, right? They are the ethical and epistemic conditions of knowing and meaning making. So we come back now to this question of cultivating humanity explicitly. The capacities I've highlighted as essential are not abstract skills. They are formed through sustained engagement with texts, with people, and with complexity. And if we systematically remove students and researchers from the very practices through which these capacities are developed, because those practices are labeled routine, then we risk preserving the appearance of higher order thinking, while at the same time hollowing out its foundations. Now, the discussion of AI, I think, points us towards something broader than any one tool. AI is not operating in isolation. I know it's on all of our minds, but it's part of a wider transformation in the technological conditions under which academic life now unfolds. Across higher education, knowledge production is increasingly mediated by digital platforms. Everyone's here is on a laptop or a phone. There's a lot of automated systems and data-driven infrastructures. And these things prioritize speed, efficiency, and scale. But these systems don't simply assist existing practices that we have. They are beginning to reshape how engagement with knowledge takes place, how quickly it moves, how it is encountered. So what we're seeing is not a shift in who or what performs certain tasks, but a more general reconfiguration of the conditions under which meaning-making unfolds. Now, the danger here is the gradual erosion of attentiveness, of sustained engagement, of embodied encounters through which meaning becomes relational, contested, accountable. As pedagogical interactions are increasingly mediated through screens, the conditions under which meaning-making unfolds are changing, and with them, the relational conditions through which humanity is cultivated are becoming a lot more fragile. So if, as I've suggested, humanity depends on the forms of meaning-making that are iterative, relational, open to revision, then the changes that we are seeing take place at a frankly alarming rate are significant. They are significant here. They might not prevent interpretation and meaning-making altogether, but they risk altering its very texture. They are reducing the time spent grappling with ambiguity and displacing some of the relational encounters through which meaning is negotiated and made accountable. So, I'm done now, which is great, but I do have one closing thing to say. Universities are changing, and there's no denying that. But the question is whether they will continue to sustain the kinds of engagement through which meaning remains relational, contested, and open, or whether those engagements will become less central to academic life. If they do, then the practices through which we learn to interpret, to relate, and to take responsibility for our interpretations may gradually recede, and with them the possibility of cultivating humanity as a central purpose of higher education. So I am convinced that if we, all of us, don't deliberately cultivate relational, reflective, and justice-oriented practices in our institutions, those practices will not survive by accident. We have got to do the work to keep them there. So fighting for the version of the university in which it is a site for the cultivation of humanity, I think is probably the most important form of resistance that is available to us in this present moment. And it is up to each and every one of you to go forward and do this. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paphitis. Just to declare too, Dr. Charlie had come up and said that her speech would be longer than intended, but she had to cover all the content. So the concession that she asked, if it's okay, is if we can reduce the 3 questions down to maybe 1 or 2, and a request from her directly to engage with the QR code that I'll put up. So I've said I'll give Dr. Charlie my logins, and so she can extract it straight after the session and start emailing. So as you engage with that, it might also be helpful, if you feel comfortable, for you to leave some contact details there as well, so that makes it easy for Charlie to respond directly to you if you don't have time to ask questions. So that being said, QR code is there. Please scan and add any questions or inputs. Are there any immediate burning ones from the floor that we can take? We've got just enough time for 2. Looking for hands, scoping. Where? There's one hand there, and There is a second hand over there. I do see you, Prof, but I'm going to try to take the hand at the back. I'm going to start over here. Oh, coming to the back. And it's Nosi from Roos. Is this an inside job? Nosi, if you could just stand too, because I know there's still some cameras.
Thank you so much. Enkosi kakhulu Shali for a keynote. Ezikisiza ukucinga. That's thought-provoking. I thought I should ask a question because Shali was my former colleague, and she was also my supervisor when I was doing my master's, and now she's currently my colleague because she's an associate researcher at RUS. So Shali, you spoke about narrative imaginative. So in the context of inequality, how can we ensure that that in this narrative that we're talking about does not become something that we speak for, but rather than something that it is more genuinely co-created with communities, especially in the context of a culturally diverse community that we are currently living in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the second hand at the back.
Good afternoon, Dr. Shali. Thank you so much for your illuminating contribution today. I think for me, I am actually even more uncomfortable the more and more you spoke. There is a category of people, I think, within higher education called community engagement practitioners or professionals. And every single time you mention the word student, I put that in there. So how can we articulate or make sense of your contribution to that category of people, and how can institutions talk about this in a more meaningful way, taking in consideration your entire presentation and just swapping the word student with community engagement practitioners or professionals? Thank you.
All right. Dr. Charlie, over to you. And if we can squeeze a minute afterwards, then I'll give you a second, Prof. Topensky.
Okay, thank you for those great questions. I'll go with Nozi first, and then I might need to come back to you to get a little bit more clarity about exactly what you're asking. But I think this idea of narrative imagination, it's really important for us to think about that not in an aesthetic way, as I was suggesting, but to think of it in that way in which our interpretations are changed relationally through how we receive and respond to each other. Is this making sense to you, Nancy? Because you're taking pictures. Good. Okay. And so I guess the whole point of what I was trying to say is that is exactly how we escape doing something that is observational of people's experiences rather than being relational in terms of those experiences. So when we're encountering somebody in a community setting and we're listening to their story, it's a very different setup to if they had written a book and I read about their story in the book. If I read about their story in the book, that might cultivate some kind of narrative imagination in me, but it's the kind that you're saying you don't want to see, right? Because it's not co-created. But when we encounter each other in the field, in engaged work, there's a space for us to shift the interpretation from just the interpretation I might have made from the text that I read, because I can keep renegotiating the meaning that I'm drawing from that text in conversation with you. And that relational work is the business of co-creation. I think a lot of us talk about co-creation, and very few of us talk about what that actually really boils down to, what it means. And what I'm suggesting is that relational work where we're renegotiating meanings through our interaction together is the business of co-creation. So I hope that kind of answers your question, Ozzy. I've got a thumbs up. Okay, to the second question, I'm really sorry. I'm not sure that I 100% understand exactly what you're asking. Where do you want me to insert community engagement professionals instead of students? Is it that you're wanting us to cultivate humanity in community engagement professionals. Could you just clarify? Can you take the mic back?
May I, wait, before you do, ma'am, may I actually
Okay.
suggest, just to perhaps
Lovely.
give Prof. Tabensky a second,
Okay.
can I ask the two of you to connect, and then
Yes, yeah,
that can be the first question that's answered.
Oh, you mean connect after?
Connect afterwards, yeah.
I was just going to connect.
Sorry, Charlie, that was amazing. We have 6 minutes. So, Professor Tabensky, if you can ask your question in 2 minutes, then Charlie, you'll have 4
Okay.
to respond.
I need less than 2 minutes. Charlie,
I'll need you to use the mic and stand briefly.
yeah,
Who are you?
I'm Pedro.
You
You
can
know me.
introduce yourself.
I'm Pedro, everyone. Hi. I made her, kind of, I could say. Can I say that? I made you? I made you?
You made me.
I was your supervisor.
Everyone,
It's the same
Pedro
thing.
made me.
Yeah. So it makes me so proud to be a teacher and see how my students flourish and the work that they do. It makes my day. So thank you.
Thank
I
you,
love
Pedro.
your talk. It was wonderful, beautiful. Your gentle criticisms and sympathetic criticisms of Nussbaum and Peter Singer are well taken. I think there's a more general criticism there that's implicit in your talk, and I want you to bring it out more explicitly, although I think it's there anyway, which is, if the university is the house of knowledge, then we should be producing knowledge. If knowledge is connected to action, then we're not producing knowledge, and hence we're not being what we're supposed to be doing. So we're kind of we're existing in an ironic state. And
The
that's my
ironic
question.
institution.
Yes, we're ironic institutions.
I like
And I just
it.
wanted to comment on that. That's it.
It's a great comment, Pedro, and thank you. I think that's actually really helpful to clarify my thinking further on this topic. So thank you for that contribution. That was quick, super quick.
Do you want to add, Margie? Anything so that you don't yell at me? Can we have a microphone for Dr. Maestri? And Pedro is really just trying to become reviewer number 2, huh?
Yeah.
Dr. Maestri.
I just wanted to add this, that we talk about knowledge and then action, but I think there's something that Ron Barnett spoke about many years ago in terms of curriculum, and that's knowledge, action, and being. It's a being that we are losing out on, and in losing out on the being, we are losing out on the cultivation of humanity. And I think that is quite important. We must bring in this idea that it has to be knowledge, action, and being. So if you get an opportunity to read Ron Barnett's, a book, and he's been writing papers for a long time on curriculum should be about knowledge, action, and being. Thanks.
Margie, I think that's a great addition, and I think it speaks really directly to the point I was trying to make about who we are as academics, as community partners, as people who are out there meeting students generally. The important part is our being, and the way we are, our being, is modeled by students, and so it's critical. It's very important. Thanks, Margie. Cool.
May we please give Dr. Paphitis a round of applause? All right, we're going to swiftly move on to the next session. I know the program states it's tea, coffee, and refreshments. Oh, sorry, Charlie, you can take your stuff. But in order to protect the time and just to make sure that there's no further delays, we're going to jump into the launch and then just continue the rest of the day. Di did promise to add extra ice cream to dessert tonight, so just to make up for the loss of tea this afternoon. This will be the launch of the special edition of the African Journal of Higher Education Community Engagement. The book first, too. Oh, book and then the journal. And for this session, then I'm going to invite soon to be Dr. Claire McCann, all the way in the back. Hi, Claire. Claire will be facilitating and chairing this session. I'm loving embarrassing people. So please give Claire a warm round of applause. Let me take this down. Sure. Do you have a copy of the book somewhere?
We
A picture?
we might have a picture. Di, do you have an online picture of the book cover? Your guess is as good as mine. Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the warm introduction. We're still quite away from doctor, but I'm going to hold on to that very tightly. Thank you all for being here for our book launch for the book Higher Education and Community Engagement, The Cultivation of Humanity. So I must just thank our keynote speaker, Dr. Paphitis, for creating the most brilliant way for me to come up and announce the specific book. But this book began as a dialogue a year ago in May 2025 about higher education, about community engagement, and ultimately what it means to be human together. If there is one thing that this work has taught me, it's that the cultivation of humanity is never something that we can finish, define neatly, or contain within a single book. It is ongoing. It asks us to stay in the conversation within and beyond the pages of the book. And so please, if Margie reaches out to you to contribute a chapter for the next edition, say yes. It's very difficult to say no. What I'm going to do in these next few minutes that we've been allocated is I'm going to give a very brief overview of the book. I'm going to give many acknowledgements and thank yous. I'm then going to hand over to our Vice Chancellor, Dr. Sizwe Mabizela, to say a few words. And after that, I'm going to highlight some of the contributions. And then we have another launch after that of our very first special issue of our African Journal of Higher Education Community Engagement. So we'll move on to that next. But for the book itself, across the pages, we argue that cultivating humanity is not an optional extra in higher education, but essential for the purpose of our institutions. Especially in South Africa, but across the entire world, where histories of colonialism, apartheid, and inequality continue to shape our institutions and our lives. This book is deeply local, but it is also global, drawing on contributions not only from South Africa, but from India and the Caribbean. What emerges in the book is the idea that community engagement, when done with care and intention, can be a powerful humanizing force. We suggest that this engagement rests on a few simple but demanding commitments: to acknowledge the work of repair rather than diminishing injustice, to enter into dialogue across difference, to recognize our deep interdependence and entanglement, and to practice humanity, because this cultivation of humanity, as we heard, is not an abstract ideal, but it is something we do every day in how we teach and how we relate to one another. This work asks us to listen, to unlearn, to be uncomfortable, to recognize when we make mistakes, and amplify how we learn from them. It asks us to build relationships in cases where outcomes are uncertain, to pause and to be slow in defiance of the ways in which our research and academic work is incentivized. And it asks us to remain in the work even when the work remains difficult. The cultivation of humanity is not merely an institutional project. It is personal. It exists in small acts of care, in moments of humility, and our willingness to learn from one another. So I can promise one thing, and that is that the book offers no answers, really. It offers an invitation to reimagine higher education, to reconnect knowledge with lived experience, and to participate in the ongoing, imperfect, uneven work of cultivating humanity together. And there are so many people that we have to thank for this output. And if anything demonstrates our interdependence, for me, it's the work of writing a book together. So we extend our sincere gratitude to the contributing authors who so generously agreed to transform their dialogues in May into their dialogue presentations into written chapters. I know many are in the room today, which is really special. Your willingness to engage with this book project with so much energy and care has made the volume possible. We also want to thank the anonymous peer reviewers for their generosity of time and spirit and their insightful feedback, which strengthened the quality and the depth of the work. And of course, special thanks needs to go to Diana Hornby, head of Rhodes University Community Engagement, for her leadership and guidance in bringing this book project to fruition. Our appreciation goes to Vice Chancellor Sizwe Mabizela, who I'll call up soon, for his support for this initiative, as well as to Professor Peter Clayton, former Deputy Vice Chancellor, for his participation in the dialogue and his ongoing encouragement. There are many individuals who made this endeavor possible, so I am deeply grateful to Wynand van der Walt in the back there, Anela Mabona, and the Rhodes University Library platform for enabling the open access publication of this book, ensuring its wider reach and impact. And I will call on Wynand soon to launch our book. We also need to acknowledge with deep appreciation Jeannie McOwen, our professional editor, and John Bertram, our graphic designer responsible for design and layout. Their expertise, dedication, and ability to work with extremely demanding timelines has been invaluable in this process. The making of the book, like the work it advocates, has been a profoundly relational endeavor, reminding us that we come into being through others, and that the cultivation of humanity is always a shared undertaking. But ultimately, thanks must go to Margie Maestri, who spearheaded this work with such deep commitment. I've heard many people talk about Margie Maestri over the last few days, and the resounding thing I've heard is that you can never say no to anything she asks. And I asked her why she thought this was the case, and she said, "Oh, I'm just a little old lady." But Margie, I have to tell you, people say yes, firstly, because you are fearsome, but secondly, because you spearhead this work and all the work you do with the commitment and love that has shaped my own understanding of the cultivation of humanity. Thank you for your leadership, for your intellectual bravery, for your massive generosity and care, for your mentorship, and for the sheer force of will that brought this together. Can we all pause here and give a massive round of applause to Margie Maestri? And now it is my deep honor to call on Rhodes University Vice Chancellor Sizwe Mabizela to say a few words on this volume. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. Charlie, thank you so much for your lucid exposition, particularly of the work of Nussbaum, but also for reminding us that institutional culture is deeply implicated in the creation or cultivation of humanity. Thank you very much for that. One thing that I really think is important, and we must take this with us as we leave, the fight to keep universities as sites for the cultivation of humanity remains both vital and worthwhile. The fight to keep universities as sites for the cultivation of humanity remains both vital and worthwhile. So thank you very much for that. And of course, your presentation provides a useful segue for my contribution this afternoon. So I am indeed deeply honored and privileged to have this opportunity to share a few reflections as we mark the launch of the book Higher Education and Community Engagement, the Cultivation of Humanity, and also the special edition of the African Journal of Higher Education, Community Engagement. Of course, this occasion provides a meaningful platform to reflect on the evolving role of higher education and its broader project of human development. As you have heard, the book emerges from an intellectual dialogue on the cultivation of humanity that was convened last year. And thanks, Claire, for acknowledging all those who made a contribution. As has been highlighted by a number of presentations at this conference, institutions of higher learning are not merely sites for advanced knowledge production. They are also critical spaces in which humanity's ongoing effort to understand itself and the world is rigorously pursued. All the presentations since yesterday are quite focused on that. So I'll make some comments based on the foreword, which is in the book, and you can read more about it. So the missions of the universities extend beyond the transmission of knowledge to encompass the ethical shaping of how that knowledge is applied in our society. But that mission also includes the formation of young people as critical, compassionate, thoughtful, and engaged global citizens, graduates who are not merely content to accept society and the world as they are, but can critically imagine a more just, a more humane, and more equitable alternative to what we have. And that they should possess the courage, conviction, and agency to act in ways that transform society and the world for the better. This vision finds one of its most influential articulations in the work of John Henry Newman. In The Idea of a University, Newman advances the conception of higher education that resists reduction to vocational or technical training. Higher education is not just about skills and competencies, and you can't reduce it to that. Instead, he emphasizes the cultivation of the intellect as an end in itself, alongside the formation of character. So, for Newman, the university is tasked with producing not narrow specialists, but intellectually mature individuals, capable of critical judgment, intellectual balance, and breadth of understanding. Importantly, his defense of knowledge for its own sake is not devoid of ethical significance. Rather, intellectual formation is itself a moral and humanizing process, shaping individuals' capacities for responsible social engagement and sustained commitment to truth. This understanding of education as an intrinsically moral enterprise finds strong resonance with the work of Martha Nussbaum, as we have just heard. Of course, whose notion of the cultivation of humanity foregrounds the development of critical, empathetic, and ethically responsive citizens. Of course, Nussbaum did her work a few decades after Newman. For Nussbaum, as for Newman, education is concerned not only with the epistemic acquisition, but with the formation of persons capable of reflective judgment, democratic participation, and human engagement with difference. However, in the contemporary context, the question of the purpose of higher education has assumed renewed agency. We all live in an era marked by rapid technological advancement that was mentioned earlier, deepening existential uncertainties, and increasingly narrow and rigid conceptions of nationalism and national interest, all of which are reshaping the social, political, and intellectual interactions in complex and, in many respects, unsettling ways. These conditions are further shaped by the forces of globalization and the pernicious market-oriented logics, which have had a significant impact on higher education systems across the globe. Most notably, higher education has been increasingly shaped by the forces of marketization and the commodification of knowledge, where knowledge is treated as a tradable commodity, and universities are expected to operate as business entities. As noted earlier today by Dr. Tandon, some universities have gone so far as to advertise themselves on the basis of pay packages that their alumni are able to secure in employment. The pernicious influence of global rankings and league tables as primary indicators of quality has narrowed the understanding of excellence in higher education, privileging quantifiable outputs and reputational metrics over meaningful contributions to society, community engagement, and the broader cultivation of humanity. I'm proud that Rhodes University is the only university in this country that has publicly declared that they are not interested in global rankings games. We don't participate for many reasons, but chief among those is that those global rankings lack any scientific basis. They're devoid of any scientific basis. They don't recognize the context in which you work. They don't recognize community engagement and the contribution you make to the society. I always have a great pleasure of engaging some of my colleagues who participate in these global rankings. And this is where dishonesty is a big challenge. They will say to you, oh, well, no, we know those things don't matter. But they continue to participate and celebrate when they rise up the rankings. So I've learned to accept that people will say one thing and do another. Within this contemporary context, fundamental tension emerges between two compelling paradigms. I mentioned that yesterday. On the one hand, higher education is conceived as a public good, a social institution committed to advancing democratic citizenship, fostering social development, and cultivating critical, ethical, and reflective individuals. On the other, it is increasingly framed as a private good, an investment directed towards enhancing employability, driving economic growth, and securing individual economic benefits. Again, as argued yesterday, while the imperatives associated with employability, economic development, and individual economic benefits cannot be dismissed, their dominance risks undermining the broader scope and purpose of higher education. A narrowly instrumentalist orientation overshadows that broader humanistic mission of higher education. Beyond measurable outputs and market responsiveness lies a deeper educational imperative, the formation of a whole person. This includes development of ethical reasoning, critical discernment, empathetic understanding, and a sustained commitment to the common good. To speak of the cultivation of humanity, therefore, is to insist on education that engages both the intellect and the conscience. We have had much of this in this conference. It is to affirm that higher education must enable individuals not only to know, but to care, not only to analyze, but to act with ethical responsibility in a complex and interdependent world. This book takes up this challenge through the platform of community engagement, exploring how higher education institutions can indeed embody and enact their humanistic mission in tangible ways. It offers a range of philosophical and theoretical reflections on the role of community engagement as a powerful and enabling vehicle for the intentional and purposeful cultivation of humanity. One such philosophy is Ubuntu. We have heard much about Ubuntu, that time-honored African ethical framework which affirms that an individual's humanity is inextricably bound to the humanity of others. And within this philosophical tradition, our own humanity reaches its fullness or its fullest expression, not in isolation, but through the recognition, affirmation, and advancement of the humanity of others. It situates knowledge, ethics, and social responsibility within an interconnected understanding of self, community, and the natural environment. For many of us, particularly those who respect the environment, the natural environment is intrinsically part of who we are. In doing so, it provides a powerful counterpoint to individualistic and market-driven conceptions of higher education and recenters the collective and moral dimensions of learning. Ultimately, to engage with this book is to be reminded that education, at its best, is an act of hope. It is an affirmation that humanity can be cultivated, not merely inherited, and that higher education institutions, when true and faithful to their highest ideals and purpose, remain among the most powerful instruments for that cultivation of humanity. May this work inspire students, scholars, and citizens alike to see the university not only as a site of instruction and research, but as a living, evolving project in the making of a more thoughtful, just, equitable, and humane world. Above all, may it serve as a source of inspiration to meaningfully transform both pedagogy and institutional culture, fostering an environment that intentionally nurtures and advances the cultivation of humanity among students, staff, and the broader society. I thank you.
Thank you very much for those powerful comments. And ahead of launching the book, I just want to highlight some of the contributors. There's probably not enough time to highlight exactly what goes in their chapters, but I would like all of the contributors to stand when I call their names, because we're very lucky to have many of them in the room today. So our first chapter after the introduction is entitled Higher Education, Community Engagement, and the Cultivation of Humanity, and that is by our keynote speaker, Charlie Paphitis. So if you could please stand. And for the sake of time, I'm going to ask that we hold the applause to the end because we have many contributors to the book. Then we have Educating for the Cultivation of Humanity, Integrating Ubuntu, Universal Human Values, and the Ethics of Care in Higher Education. So that is Margie Maestri. Amy Deshpande, who is not here, but Monica should be in the back if she hasn't left. Then we have a piece on cultivating humanity, reflexivity in higher education, community engagement in South Africa by Bonani Netchandama from the University of Venda. Then we have the social construction of race, Ubuntu as an ethical foundation for addressing racism and promoting the cultivation of humanity in South Africa, by Gray Magaiza and Brenda Muchabveo. Thank you, Gray. And then we have Reimagining Community Engagement in Higher Education Institutions to Cultivate Humanity Through Integral Education and Ubuntu by Kanya Parayachi. Okay, we might as well clap because... Then we have, and I hope they're still here, Rekindling the Love of Learning Through Service Learning by Pedro Tabensky and Lindsay Kelland. And then we have Community Engagement and the Work of Cultivating Humanity with Insights from Young People's Experiences in Makanda. And I think Nwabisa Nkani might be here today, but this is by Lizole Jalajala. Nwabisa Nkani, if you're here, please stand. Zanonkolo Nyangiwe, Zandile Valela, and me. And then we have Community University Engagement as a Model for University Transformation and the Cultivation of Humanity by George Openjuru, David Monk, and Robert Juko. Thank you so much. And then two authors who we don't have here today. The 10th chapter is Institutional Initiatives for Promoting the Cultivation of Humanity through the case study of Christ University in India. And then the last empirical chapter, the author is not here, but I want to ask potentially for the IRSLICE members in the group to stand. So I'm looking at Tim, I'm looking at George, and I'm looking at the other Tim too, because this was a chapter done by Dr. Shalona Philanders, who won the dissertation award last year for IRSlice. So at least we have some colleagues in the room. Thank you. And so we want to hold that space for Shalona, who spoke to introducing eco-autoethnography, the weaving of wholeness in community-engaged praxis across the Atlantic. And so hopefully this gives us all a chance to see the real variety of contributions from different contexts, but which are all deeply place-based. And at this stage, I'd like to call on Wynand van der Walt to launch our book, which will be available on the Rhodes University Community Engagement website from Friday onwards. And just before that, I want to read very quickly our dedication, which is to the universal consciousness that binds us in our diversity, the spirit of Ubuntu. For this is a reflection on our common humanity, on interdependence and interconnectedness, on love and harmony. It is an invitation to embrace holism and humanism alongside pragmatism and rationalism, and to recognize that through thought, word, and action, new and shared pathways in education and in life can emerge. Thank you very much. Over to Wynand.
Thank you, Claire. And Dr. Mabizela, I would like to add to what you said. The community engagement at Rhodes is most probably one of our most valuable partnerships, because they don't just say in theory and do differently. They practice what they preach. When it comes to community engagement, there should be no barrier to information, to scholarly information. And from the start, this partnership between the library and RUS has been absolutely perfect. A perfect display of dedication, quality, but also absolutely no barrier for the author or for the reader. And it's now extended beyond the journal to the book itself. And although there's no specific site yet, book publishing site for RUS, I anticipate many, many more books. And we will then consider, obviously, migrating to a specific site for RUS. Now, normally I would press a button. I understand there's no button to press today. So I cheated slightly, and I pressed a button before we got here. So Claire's right. The book will be fully accessible by Friday, so it's churning away in the background. You're already able to access the PDFs and to see some of the metadata as we are talking on the Rhodes University monographs site. So you can go to monographs.ru.ac.za. You can go to the second press, which after I said it's Rhodes Press, and you can then click on catalog, and it's the third book that's available there, and you can go and explore. I really want to thank you for the partnership and for using the library and for enabling us to fill our mandate optimally as well. So it's a great, thank you, Claire. And, it's so nice to see everybody in person, actually. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm not going to click a button. I'm just going to say thank you and clap my hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we have another launch, so you might be getting a bit sick of my voice, but we also have a really important first special issue of the African Journal of Higher Education Community Engagement. And what's really special about this is that this comes from the inaugural conference on the scholarship of engagement hosted by Mangosuthu University of Technology in KwaZulu-Natal in November of last year. So truly it is a testament to the incredible insights that came from that conference last year. It includes 6 peer-reviewed contributions that seek to advance the conference theme, bridging the knowledge gap and advancing the scholarship of engagement for maximum societal impact. This conference responded to a growing imperative in South Africa for higher education institutions to adopt the scholarship of engagement, an approach that emphasizes aligning academic work with societal needs and desires through engaged pedagogy, community-based research, and collaborative practices. It provided a platform for interdisciplinary knowledge exchange and community engagement aimed at strengthening the integration of community engagement into teaching, learning, and research, with a focus on sharing best practices, developing practical strategies, and contributing to the body of knowledge on the scholarship of engagement. And we're delighted to be able to host this important body of scholarship, which will be fully open access and online on the African Journal for Higher Education Community Engagement site. I would like to invite Professor Busisiwe Nkonki Mandleni to introduce the special issue and its contributions. Is your voice okay to introduce it? I see you're standing up, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. Professor Busisiwe Nkonki Mandleni is the Director of Community Engagement and Development at Mangosuthu University of Technology in KwaZulu-Natal, where she leads the design and implementation of innovative initiatives that strengthen community-university partnerships and enhance the societal relevance of learning, teaching, and research. With a PhD in environmental management and 25 years of experience in higher education, she has made significant leadership contributions in advancing community engagement. She currently serves as the interim chairperson of the Community Engagement South Africa, CESA, where she coordinates strategic leadership on diverse forms of community engagement. Recognized for her collaborative leadership and strategic stakeholder engagement, she's dedicated to advancing higher education as a socially responsible force, serving communities and champion epistemic, social, and environmental justice. We welcome you, and the floor is yours.
My voice is not completely back, but I'll try. Thank you very much, Claire. Thanks, Maggie. Thanks, Rose University, under the leadership of Professor Mabizela. And thanks to the MUT and other universities, colleagues that contributed to this journal. Claire has already given you the background, so all I need to do is, she has made my life very easy. I'm just going to share with you the papers that will be appearing on the journal. The first one is a paper by Jacqueline Skippers and Karen Fenter, if they can stand up. From Deficit to Flourishing, a praxis framework for positive discourse in community university partnerships. Their paper provides a conceptual anchor for the shift by demonstrating how discourse shapes the possibilities of engagement. By moving from deficit-based to asset-based language and grounding practice in Ubuntu and integrative power, it offers a praxis framework that actively bridges epistemic divides and fosters more equitable and trusted-based partnerships. Thank you so much, Claire. I'm sorry, Jackie and Karen. The second one is by Sitembile Kosi from Mangosuthu University of Technology. She's not here, unfortunately, but I do have colleagues from MUT. His paper is on Wild Connect ZA, case study for decolonizing conservation and democratizing the knowledge. Then the third one, Bruce Damons, if you can stand up, together with Rangana Noluvo and Joseph Jonathan. I'm not sure if they're here. The article is looking at eco-pedagogy in practice, a transdisciplinary model for community-based scholarship of engagement in semi-rural schools. The fourth one is also from MUT. Bibin, George, Themba Mngomeni, and Ayanda Sizwe Sondo. They are not here, unfortunately. Their paper looks at integrating IKS into physics education challenges and entrenched epistemological hierarchies within STEM disciplines. Then the fourth one is from Joanna Rose Mabisela, I think she's around, Constance Laga, and Emia Muleya, if they are around, if they can stand up. and give them a round of applause. Their paper is focusing on will highlights another critical dimension of bridging knowledge gap, the integration of theory and practice. Then the last one is a contribution by Kehinde Agadeba, who demonstrates how the National Arts Festival functions as a relational and participatory site of engaged scholarship. I'm not sure if he's around. If he's not around, let's just give him a round of applause in his absence. I'm going to stop here because my voice is hoarse, but I just want to thank Rhodes University on behalf of Mangosuthu University, who are very humbled. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Busi. Busi, I bumped into her Monday. She said she was in Germany, I think last week, and next week she's going somewhere else. I think by the time May ends, she's going to be texting everything because her voice is getting flatter and flatter. Please have some tea. We have, I think, 3 more sessions before the day ends, and it's going to run until 5. Then there's going to be an hour-and-a-half break before a gala dinner tonight. And my understanding is that there isn't a formal program. It's really a chance to break bread, have some good discussions, and watch me dance the VC off the dance floor. It's a social space. So from here, there won't be any other plenary sessions. We'll see each other in the morning in this space. So from here, please move on to your venue. I know Claire had organized a small private session to do. Do you want to speak to that one? Yes.
So I'm really hoping no one is at the grounds of the monument right now, hoping for a walking tour, because I recognize that was just about to start a few minutes ago. For those who have signed up to join my walking tours, there was one that was meant to start about 5 minutes ago, and there's one that starts in an hour. Can I please ask that everyone on both tours comes to the one that starts in an hour at 4:45, so that we have enough time to get through it properly instead of rushing through 2. So if you have signed up, I look forward to seeing you just outside the monument on the grounds at 4:45. Thank you.
Outside of that, please enjoy the rest of the afternoon, and I'll see you this evening.